The man who paid for her was a study in granite and grief. His name was Caleb, a word as blunt and hard as the land he worked. He stood on the porch of a house that seemed to have been carved from the same sorrow that shaped him, a silhouette against the vast, unforgiving sky. Mai descended from the wagon, her small bundle clutched in her hands, the fabric worn thin as a prayer. The wind was a predator, clawing at her clothes, whispering of isolation. There was no welcome in his eyes, only appraisal. He looked not at her face, but at the contract in the driver's hand, a piece of paper that declared her purpose: cook, laundress, housekeeper. A ghost to fill the empty spaces. He passed a leather pouch heavy with coin to the driver, the clink of metal a final, cold transaction that severed her from one bleak reality and tethered her to another. He did not offer his hand. He did not speak her name. He simply gestured toward the door with a tilt of his chin. "The work is inside," he said, his voice the grating sound of rust on iron. The door opened into a silence that was deeper than mere quiet. It was an absence, a hollowed-out thing that clung to the furniture and lay thick as dust on the floorboards. This was not a home, it was a monument to something lost, and she was to be its silent caretaker. He showed her to a small room at the back, little more than a closet with a cot. It was clean but cold, the air thin and forgotten. He left her there without another word, the sound of his heavy boots receding down the hall a sentence of profound and utter solitude. Her first days were a conversation with the house itself. She learned the geography of his pain in the undisturbed dust on a mantelpiece, in the single tin cup and plate left to dry by the sink, in the way every curtain was drawn tight against the sun. The house held its breath, and she moved within its lungs, careful not to exhale too loudly. She began her work not to please him, for she sensed he was beyond pleasing, but to carve out a space where life could persist. She scrubbed the floors until the pale wood grain emerged like a forgotten memory. She washed the windows, letting in slivers of reluctant light that fell across the room in pale, apologetic stripes. She found a small room with a locked door at the end of the hall. She did not ask about it. Some sorrows were not meant to be disturbed. Caleb watched her from the periphery, a hawk circling a field mouse. He saw the efficient, silent movements, the way she mended a tear in a blanket with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He had paid for labor, and she provided it with a grace that unsettled him. It felt less like service and more like a quiet reclamation. A part of him, the bitter, wounded part, resented the intrusion of order into his carefully curated chaos. But another, deeper part, a part he thought long dead, felt a strange, unwelcome stirring. It was the feeling of a frozen river in the first days of spring, the groan of ice beginning to break under a pressure it could no longer withstand. He would find her polishing the tarnished silver of a single, small spoon, and the sight would send a shard of memory through him so sharp it stole his breath. He would turn and leave, retreating to the barn, to the familiar company of his own ghosts. One afternoon, while beating a rug outside, she saw the child. A small girl with hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and eyes the same stormy gray as her father's. She stood half-hidden behind a rain barrel, a ghost in her own home, watching Mai with a solemn, unblinking curiosity. Mai offered a small, hesitant smile. The child did not smile back, but she did not run. This became their ritual. The girl, Lily, would watch from a distance as Mai worked. She was as silent as her father, a small, pale echo in the vast, quiet house. One evening, Mai sat by her cot, folding a scrap of paper from a discarded ledger. Her fingers, nimble and sure, creased and folded the stiff paper until it became a delicate bird, its wings poised for flight. The next morning, she left it on the porch rail where she knew the child would see it. She watched from the kitchen window as Lily approached, her small hand reaching out to touch the fragile creation. The girl picked it up, her fingers tracing its delicate form, before she scurried away, clutching the paper bird to her chest. The following day, a single, wild prairie rose, its petals a defiant splash of pink against the muted landscape, lay on the worn blanket of Mai's cot. It was a message, an offering, a treaty signed in a language that needed no words. Caleb saw the flower in Mai's room when he passed by the open door. He stopped, his gaze lingering on the impossible bloom. He knew where it grew, in a sheltered spot by the creek where his wife had once planted a small garden. He had not been there in years. The fact that his daughter had gone, that she had picked a flower for this stranger, was a tremor in the foundation of his grief. It was the first bridge built across the chasm of their silence, and it had not been built by him. The house began to change in ways that were subtle at first, then undeniable. The scent of yeast and baking bread pushed back against the stale smell of sorrow. The rhythmic thump of a kneading dough became a new, steady heartbeat in the home's hollow chest. Ma would sometimes hum as she worked, a low, melodic tune from a land Caleb could not imagine. It was a sound so alien and yet so fundamentally comforting that it snagged in his memory. Soon, he heard another sound accompanying it, Lily's small, tentative humming, a fragile harmony to Ma's quiet song. He found himself lingering by the kitchen doorway, drawn by the warmth that radiated from the old wood stove, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He would watch Ma's hands as she shelled peas or stitched a patch onto Lily's worn dress. They were hands that spoke of hardship but moved with an innate gentleness. He never spoke, but his presence was a question he did not know how to ask. One evening, as Ma tucked Lily into bed, the child looked up at her, her grey eyes wide and serious in the lamplight. She had begun to speak to Ma in whispers, her voice a rusty key in a long unturned lock. "Ma," she whispered, her small hand clutching the paper bird. "Does my papa's heart hurt?" The question, in its devastating simplicity, hung in the air. Ma did not know the child's father was standing in the shadows of the hallway, his hand braced against the wall as if to hold himself upright. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow, a child's innocent observation that laid his soul bare. He retreated before Ma could answer, the question echoing in the frozen chambers of his heart, a crack spreading through the ice. He found her by a small patch of barren earth behind the house, where she was turning the soil with a rusty trowel. The ground was hard, packed dense by years of neglect and unforgiving sun. He stood there for a long moment, watching her struggle, the wind whipping strands of dark hair across her face. The silence stretched between them, familiar and heavy. "The soil is hard here," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Nothing's grown in that spot for years. It was the first thing he had said to her that was not an instruction. It was an observation, a shared acknowledgement of the world they inhabited. Ma paused, looking up at him, her expression unreadable. She did not seem surprised. "All soil is hard at first," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "It needs care." Water. She turned back to her work, her meaning hanging in the air between them, as much about the patch of dirt as it was about the barren landscape of their lives. He did not leave. He walked to the barn and returned with a heavy spade and a bucket of water from the well. He didn't say another word, but he began to break the earth, his powerful shoulders driving the spade deep into the reluctant ground. They worked side by side as the sun began to set, two solitary figures turning the soil, a silent partnership born of a few simple words. He noticed the calluses on her hands, the determined set of her jaw. He had purchased a servant, a function, a pair of hands. But standing there, with the smell of turned earth in the air, he saw a woman. A woman with a strength that mirrored the unyielding land around them, and a persistence that promised life could, perhaps, be coaxed from even the most desolate ground. The blizzard came without warning, a sudden, violent erasure of the world. It descended from a sky the color of a bruise, a howling white fury that swallowed the horizon and clawed at the little house with icy talons. The wind screamed like a banshee, rattling the window panes and finding every crack in the walls to force its way inside. They were marooned, an island of fragile warmth in a roiling sea of white. On the second day, Lily began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that quickly deepened. By nightfall, she was burning with fever, her small body trembling under a mountain of blankets. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Caleb's carefully constructed numbness. He was a capable man, a man who could mend a fence, break a horse, and read the sky, but he was utterly helpless against the fever that consumed his daughter. He saw the ghost of his wife in Lily's flushed face, felt the icy grip of a past tragedy threatening to repeat itself. He was paralyzed by it. But Ma was not. She moved with a calm, focused urgency. She bathed Lily's forehead with snow-melted water, her touch gentle and sure. She went to the small pouch she had carried with her, a bundle of dried herbs and roots that smelled of a distant earth. She crushed them, steeping them in hot water, the strange, aromatic steam filling the small room. She held the cup to Lily's lips, murmuring to her in a language he did not understand, the words like a soft, flowing river. He was forced to do nothing but watch, to trust this woman he barely knew with the only thing he had left to lose. He kept the fire roaring, his one useful contribution, and watched her through the long, dark hours, a silent, desperate vigil. In her unwavering care, he saw a strength he did not possess, a resilience that met the storm outside with a quiet storm of its own. The fire crackled, a lone beacon against the oppressive dark. The blizzard raged on, its voice a constant, mournful cry. Lily slept fitfully in her small bed, her breathing still shallow but no longer ragged. Mai sat in a chair beside her, her head bowed with exhaustion. Caleb sat across the room, the shadows carving deep hollows into his face. The silence in the room was different now, stretched thin by fear and shared vulnerability. There was a storm like this, he said, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the wind. The night she was born. The night her mother. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken grief. The doctor couldn't get through. I was alone. He looked at his hands, large and calloused, remembering how useless they had been. This room, he gestured vaguely toward the hallway, toward the locked door. It was to be the nursery. Sarah painted flowers on the wall. Tiny blue ones. He fell silent, the confession leaving him hollowed out. Mai listened, her gaze soft with an empathy that asked for nothing. After a long moment, she spoke, her own voice quiet and freighted with memory. In my village, the rains did not come. The ground cracked open like a thirsty mouth. The fields turned to dust. She looked into the fire, her eye seeing another time, another place. My parents, my little brother, we ate the seeds we had saved for planting. Then there was nothing. A man came to the village. He offered silver for passage. For a new life. She did not need to speak of the desperation, of the hunger that gnawed deeper than any grief. In the flickering firelight, they were no longer a master and his purchased servant. They were two survivors, two souls who had lost everything, their separate sorrows weaving together in the shared darkness, creating a fragile, unexpected tapestry of understanding. The storm outside had breached the walls inside, and in the wreckage, they had found a common ground. When the world returned, it was blindingly white and utterly silent. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed, pristine and peaceful beneath a pale, benevolent sun. The silence that filled the house was no longer an absence, but a calm. Lily's fever had broken in the pre-dawn hours. She was weak, but her eyes were clear when she woke, and she asked for a drink of water in a small, thin voice. The relief that washed over Caleb was so profound it left him weak. He looked at Mai, who was sleeping in the chair, her face pale with exhaustion, and felt a surge of something he could only identify as gratitude, but it was deeper than that, more complex. It was a feeling that cracked open the frozen shell of his heart and let a sliver of warmth inside. Over the next few days, as the snow began to melt, the rhythm of the house shifted. The invisible walls between them had dissolved in the crucible of the storm. He began to help her, chopping wood and hauling it inside without being asked, taking a dipper of water to her as she scrubbed the floors. One afternoon, he sat on the porch, a block of pine in one hand and a knife in the other. He began to carve, the blade peeling away layers of wood to reveal a shape within. He worked for hours, his focus absolute. When he was finished, he held a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He went inside and placed it on the table next to Mai's paper one. It was a response, a companion piece, an acknowledgement. Later that day, he was mending a harness in the barn when she approached, holding out a steaming tin mug. "Tea," she said simply. He took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he called her by her name. "Thank you, Mai." The trip to town was a necessity. The blizzard had depleted their supplies, and the thaw had made the roads passable again. As they rode in the wagon, Caleb, Mai, and Lily, it was the first time they had left the isolation of the ranch as a unit. Lily sat between them, a small, solid presence, clutching both her paper bird and her new wooden one. The town of Redemption was a collection of dusty buildings and even dustier souls. As they walked toward the general store, the stares followed them. Whispers coiled in the air like smoke, thin and poisonous. They saw not a family, but an oddity, the grim rancher, his ghost of a child, and the foreign woman who was clearly not his wife. A hulking man with a stained coat and cruel eye stepped out from the saloon, blocking their path. Caleb recognized him as one of the men who brokered passage and labor from the coast. "Well, well, Calder," the man sneered, his eyes sliding over Mai with a proprietary leer. "See, you're putting your property to good use." The word property struck Mai with the force of a slap. She flinched, her shoulders curling inward. But before the shame could take root, Caleb moved. He stepped directly in front of her, shielding her with his body. His stance was not aggressive, but it was immovable. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "She is not my property," he said, his gaze as cold and hard as river stone. "She is my intended. My future wife. And the next man in this town who shows her disrespect will answer to me." A hush fell over the street. The man, taken aback by the quiet intensity of Caleb's declaration, mumbled an apology and retreated into the saloon. Caleb did not look at him. He looked at Mai, his expression unyielding. Then he took her hand, his large, warm palm closing around hers, and led her into the general store. He bought flour, salt, and coffee, and then, from a small glass case, a simple, unadorned silver band. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence was new. It was not the barren silence of grief, but the rich, full silence of understanding. The silver ring sat in a small cloth bag in Caleb's pocket, a heavy, unspoken promise. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the prairie and painting the landscape in hues of gold and rose. The house, when they reached it, looked different. It no longer seemed like a monument to loss, but a sanctuary, a place of earned peace. He helped Mai and Lily down from the wagon, his hand lingering on Mai's arm for a moment longer than necessary. That evening, after Lily was asleep, he led Mai not to her small room, but down the hall to the locked door. He produced an old iron key from his pocket and turned it in the lock. The door swung open onto a room bathed in moonlight. It was no longer a sealed tomb of memory. It was clean, the floor swept, the air fresh. The faded blue flowers Sarah had painted on the wall were still there, faint but visible, like a gentle blessing from the past. He had prepared it. He turned to face her, his tall frame outlined by the pale light from the window. He took the small cloth bag from his pocket and retrieved the silver ring. It gleamed in the dim light. He didn't have the eloquent words of a poet, only the stark, honest truth of a man who had been returned to himself. He held out the ring. "The house needs a mistress," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "The child needs a mother." "And I?" He paused, his gaze meeting hers, raw and vulnerable. "I need a wife," he swallowed hard, laying his heart bare. "Not as part of a contract. Not as a payment. As a man asking a woman. Mai, will you marry me?" She looked from the ring to his face, seeing in his eyes not the granite of the man she had first met, but the rich, fertile earth he had turned with her, a ground where something new and beautiful could finally grow. A single tear traced a path down her cheek as she gave him her answer, a silent, graceful nod that spoke of storms weathered and a quiet, resilient love that had taken root in the hardest of soils.